Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive.
Always. What are we exploring today?
Well, today we're going back in time, back to 2008, to explore what was going on with indigenous peoples around the world.
2008. Oh, wow. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's our source material for this one?
Our trusty guide for this deep dive is The Indigenous World 2008.
Ah, that's a classic. Compiled by IWGIA, right? The International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs.
That's the one. It's an incredible resource packed with information.
Yeah, it's like a global snapshot capturing everything. You've got wins, struggles, political representation, land rights, cultural survival.
It's everything. By the time we're done with this deep dive, you'll have a good understanding of the major issues facing indigenous peoples back in 2008.
So what's first? What jumped out at you?
Well, you can't talk about 2008 without mentioning the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It had just been adopted the year before, in 2007.
Huge moment. Decades in the making. It was a major victory for indigenous peoples around the world.
You can really feel that sense of excitement in this report. Communities were energized. They were using the declaration to shine a light on their unique struggles and demand change.
It was a powerful tool for advocacy.
Definitely. Some countries, like Bolivia, even incorporated the declaration into their national law.
Wow. Now that's commitment. But not all countries were as enthusiastic, right?
Unfortunately not. Some countries, even though they voted for the declaration, were already saying, well, we'll only implement it if it doesn't clash with our existing laws.
Oh, that's frustrating. A bit of a mixed message, to
Yeah.
say the least.
Yeah, it highlights this constant tension between global recognition and what actually happens on the ground.
It's like winning on paper is just the first step. The real challenge is making those ideals a reality for indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. And this brings us to a topic that comes up again and again in this report.
Land rights.
You got it. It's a constant battle for indigenous peoples to secure their ancestral lands and protect their resources.
It's a fundamental right, but sadly one that's often violated. The report really highlights this widespread issue of indigenous peoples being forced from their homes, relocated, resettled, expelled, and often without their consent.
Which, of course, is a direct violation of the UN Declaration, Article 10, to be exact.
Right, and it's happening everywhere. The report gives the example of pastoralists in Tanzania who are being evicted from their land to make way for a national park.
Heartbreaking. And it's not an isolated incident. Similar displacements were happening in Panama and Russia, often tied to these big development projects like hydroelectric dams.
It's like economic interests are constantly being put ahead of indigenous rights and livelihoods.
It really makes you wonder, are these grand declarations actually making things better for these communities?
Well, it definitely exposes the gap between the ideal and the reality. And here's where it gets even more complicated. The report points out this strange paradox. Sometimes efforts to protect the environment, while well-intentioned, ended up negatively impacting the very people living on the land in question.
Like, they're trying to protect their land from exploitation only to be pushed aside by conservation efforts.
Exactly. It's a really tough situation. Like in Tanzania, creating a national park to protect a water catchment area for a hydropower plant ended up displacing pastoralists from their traditional lands. It's tragic.
Really highlights how these issues are never black and white.
Right. And then you have Russia, where industrial development was constantly encroaching on indigenous lands. It's an ongoing battle.
It led the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, or RAPON for short, to really step up and advocate for stronger legal protections.
They weren't just resisting. They were actively working with the government to shape policies and ensure development happened in a way that respected their rights. It shows the power of organized indigenous advocacy.
It's about having a seat at the table and being part of the solution. Now, shifting gears a bit, the report also delves into climate change. Even back in 2008, it was already disproportionately impacting indigenous communities.
And despite being on the front lines, their voices were often excluded from international discussions.
There's this really jarring example from the UN Climate Change Conference in Bali that year. Indigenous representatives were actually blocked from presenting their statement at the opening ceremony.
Wow, it's unbelievable. The people most affected, silenced.
It really highlights the need for those voices to be central to the conversation, especially if we want to find real, lasting solutions.
Absolutely. So where to next in our 2008 World Tour?
Let's zoom in on Greenland. The report dives into their journey towards self-governance, which technically began with home rule back in 1979.
Right. But it wasn't a smooth transition, was it?
Not at all. Greenland inherited this colonial structure that wasn't exactly designed for self-governance. It created some major roadblocks.
One of the biggest being the 18 municipality system. Really inefficient and difficult to reform.
But there's a glimmer of hope. In 2008, they were finally set to establish a new system with 4 major regions after years of debate.
Progress. Although, there is this one detail in the report that really caught my eye. It mentions Greenland's social and educational problems being, and I quote, cloaked with ethnic labels. I wonder what that means.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Is it a subtle way of shifting blame away from the colonial systems that created these problems?
It definitely raises questions about whose narrative is being prioritized.
Okay, next stop, Canada. Another country grappling with, you guessed it, Indigenous rights.
It's a complex issue everywhere, but especially in Canada, with its unique history and its 3 distinct groups of Indigenous peoples: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis.
The report highlights the Lumicon Nation's struggle for land rights in Alberta, and to complicate matters further, they were also dealing with oil extraction happening on their traditional territory.
A story that feels all too relevant today, unfortunately.
It is. Okay, for our last stop in part 1 of this epic deep dive, we're heading south to Latin America.
What's happening down there? Fill me in.
Well, there seems to be a bit of a mixed bag. Some positive developments, like in Ecuador and Bolivia, where they were incorporating indigenous concerns into their constitutional revisions.
That's encouraging. A sign of progress.
But then you have countries like Thailand, where the government is essentially saying, yeah, we'll implement the UN declaration, but only if it doesn't clash with our laws.
Always those caveats, right? Makes you wonder about their true commitment.
And then there's Guatemala. Get this. Rigoberta Menchú, the incredible Nobel Peace Prize winner, she ran for president in 2008.
Wow, what a moment. That must have been incredibly powerful.
It was. Although, sadly, her campaign faced a lot of racist backlash from conservative groups. Shows you how deeply ingrained prejudice can be, even in the face of these incredible milestones.
It's a reminder that achieving true equality requires more than just changing laws. It requires changing hearts and minds.
And on that note, we'll wrap up part 1 of our deep dive into the Indigenous World 2008. Stay tuned for part 2, because we've got a lot more ground to cover. Welcome back, everyone, for part 2 of our deep dive into the Indigenous World 2008. I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything we covered in part 1.
It's a lot to take in, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's what makes this report so fascinating. It's like peeling back the layers of history and revealing these complex realities that are often hidden from view.
Right. It's not just about dates and statistics. It's about the human stories, the struggles, the resilience. And as we dive deeper into part 2, I think you'll start to see how interconnected these issues really are, even though they're playing out in different parts of the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We left off talking about those political shifts in Latin America, with some countries, like Ecuador and Bolivia, taking steps to incorporate indigenous concerns into their constitutions, which was encouraging.
Yeah, definitely a step in the right direction. But at the same time, you had governments in other parts of the world, like in Thailand, that were kind of dragging their feet on implementing the UN declaration, claiming it conflicted with their laws. It's like, really? Come on.
Well, progress isn't always linear, right? There are these pushes forward and setbacks, and it makes you wonder about the motivations behind those decisions.
Yeah.
What's driving those governments to resist change?
It's a giant puzzle, and each country, each situation is a piece of that puzzle. So for our next piece, let's head over to Nicaragua. The report paints a picture of, well, let's just say a lot of political turmoil and uncertainty surrounding indigenous rights in 2008.
Yeah, there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of maneuvering. They were drafting new laws, talking about constitutional amendments. But at the same time, there were these conflicts between indigenous communities and the government, mainly over land rights and control of resources. It felt really unstable, like anything could happen.
A real sense of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Like they'd make a bit of progress, then something would happen to stall it. The report specifically mentions this border dispute between the Awastingni Mayanya community and the Tasbaraya territorial bloc, with both sides claiming ownership of the same land. It sounds incredibly messy.
It was. These territorial conflicts are always so complex because they're often rooted in these long histories of colonialism and broken treaties. It's not just about the land itself. It's about identity, about cultural survival, about who gets to control the narrative.
It's heavy stuff, and it makes you think about the long-term consequences. How does this constant struggle, this feeling of insecurity, affect the mental and emotional well-being of those communities?
Those are really important questions to consider, and I think they often get overlooked. The trauma of displacement, of losing your ancestral lands, it can be incredibly damaging. Okay, so moving on, the report takes us to Panama, where things weren't looking much brighter in 2008.
Yeah, the situation in Panama was pretty grim. The report documents some serious human rights violations, including forced displacement, imprisonment, and the destruction of indigenous territories.
One of the most glaring examples was the government's refusal to recognize the traditional leadership of the Nassau indigenous people.
Yeah.
They wouldn't grant them legal title to their lands, and they were pushing ahead with this massive hydroelectric project, the Boniek project, which would have flooded huge swaths of indigenous territory.
It's so frustrating because it feels like those in power are just completely ignoring the voices and the rights of those most affected. And get this, the report mentions that an indigenous NGO, a non-governmental organization, was actually involved in illegally approving the construction of that power plant, going against the wishes of the Nassau people.
It's a reminder that even within organizations that claim to represent indigenous interests, there can be corruption, conflicting agendas, and power struggles that undermine the collective good.
Yeah, it's complicated, but it highlights the importance of transparency and accountability. And on top of all that, the report mentions a devastating oil spill in the Chiriqui Grand Bay that affected dozens of indigenous communities who relied on the sea for their livelihoods.
It was a disaster with long-lasting consequences for their health, their environment, their ability to sustain themselves. And, to add insult to injury, the companies responsible for the spill refused to provide adequate compensation to those communities.
It's just, it makes you so angry. Why are indigenous communities constantly being forced to bear the brunt of environmental damage caused by others?
It's a question of environmental justice, and it speaks to the systemic inequalities and power imbalances that indigenous peoples face all over the world. All right, let's move on to Suriname. The report really highlights the challenges they faced in trying to get their land rights legally recognized.
Yeah, the land laws in Suriname at that time were really problematic. Basically, they considered any land in the interior to be government property, and indigenous communities were only granted these limited entitlements to their villages and the land they used for agriculture.
But that didn't include the vast territories they traditionally used for hunting, fishing, gathering medicinal plants, and all these other cultural practices that are essential to their way of life.
Right, so it's like, yeah, you can have this tiny piece of your ancestral land, but everything else is ours. It's ridiculous. The report specifically mentions the Saramacca people who were fighting to gain recognition for their traditional territory, a huge chunk of rainforest, but the government was just stalling, throwing up these bureaucratic roadblocks.
It's a classic tactic, using legal loopholes and administrative delays to basically wear down those communities and prevent them from asserting their rights. And to make matters worse, there was this really controversial mining project in West Suriname, a joint venture between BHP Billiton and Suralco that threatened to destroy a vast area of pristine rainforest inhabited by indigenous peoples.
It was a massive project, and the report points out that it didn't even meet the company's own guidelines for environmental and social impact assessments.
It felt like a clear case of profit over people, prioritizing short-term economic gains over the long-term well-being of those communities and the environment.
It's so disheartening. Okay, for our final stop in part 2 of this epic deep dive, we're going to Colombia, where the report dives into the impact of the ongoing armed conflict on indigenous peoples.
It was a truly horrific situation.
Yeah.
Indigenous communities were being caught in the crossfire between government forces, paramilitary groups, and guerrilla fighters. They faced constant violence, displacement, threats, and human rights abuses.
The report specifically mentions the Embera Catillo people, who were subjected to massacres, forced displacement, and the destruction of their sacred sites. It's just awful to think about.
And it wasn't just the physical violence, the psychological trauma, the fear, the loss of cultural identity, the forced assimilation. These have long-lasting consequences for those communities.
It's essential to recognize that these conflicts are often rooted in a long history of colonization, exploitation, and the denial of indigenous rights. It's not a coincidence that they're the ones caught in the middle.
Absolutely. And if we want to find real solutions, we need to address those root causes, those systemic injustices that perpetuate these cycles of violence.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of part 2. It's a lot to process, I know, but stay with us because we've got even more ground to cover in part 3. All right, welcome back, everyone, for the final part of our deep dive into the Indigenous World 2008. We've covered so much ground already, but there's still so much more to explore.
It's amazing how this one report manages to pack in so much information, right?
Hmm.
And it really underscores just how interconnected these issues are, how the fight for indigenous rights is this global struggle with these recurring themes playing out in all these different contexts.
It's mind-boggling. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's crucial to remember that, these aren't just stories from the past. They have this enduring relevance, and they offer these valuable lessons that we can and should apply to the present.
Totally. So where are we headed for our first stop in this final part?
Let's head over to Brazil. The report paints a pretty stark picture of the ongoing challenges faced by indigenous peoples there, especially when it comes to protecting their lands and resources.
Yeah, Brazil in 2008 was a really a volatile environment, to say the least. There were just alarming levels of violence, land invasions, and environmental degradation impacting indigenous communities.
It's heartbreaking. One of the things that really stood out to me was how slowly the government was moving on recognizing and protecting indigenous land rights. Like the report mentions hundreds of land claims just sitting there, some dating back decades, and nothing was happening.
It just shows you the systemic inequalities that were at play, right?
Right.
The lack of political will to actually address these injustices, and the consequences were dire. The report documents countless instances of violence and intimidation directed at indigenous leaders and communities who dared to speak out.
It's a reminder that for many indigenous peoples, advocating for their land rights isn't just about paperwork and legal battles, it's literally putting their lives on the line.
Absolutely. The report also goes into detail about the devastating effects of deforestation and mining on indigenous lands. And it's not just about the destruction of the environment. It's about disrupting their traditional ways of life, undermining their cultural identity.
Right, like it's this vicious cycle. Their lands are targeted for exploitation because they're rich in resources, but that exploitation just further marginalizes them and makes it harder to defend their rights.
It's a pattern we see repeated all over the world. And it really highlights the interconnectedness of environmental destruction and the violation of indigenous rights. They can't be separated.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and head over to Australia. The report covers this controversial government intervention in the Northern Territory that started in 2007.
Yeah, this intervention was supposedly intended to address child abuse and social problems in Aboriginal communities. But it was immediately met with a lot of criticism, with people calling it paternalistic, heavy-handed, and even racially discriminatory.
The measures they implemented were pretty extreme, like sending in the military, imposing restrictions on alcohol, even taking control of Aboriginal land and finances.
It was a very top-down approach, and a lot of indigenous leaders and activists felt like it completely undermined their right to self-determination. They argued that the intervention was based on these harmful stereotypes about Aboriginal people and that it failed to address the underlying issues, things like poverty, lack of access to basic services, and the trauma of colonization.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it? Showing how even well-intentioned policies, if they're not designed in genuine partnership with the communities they're meant to serve, can end up doing more harm than good.
It really highlights the importance of listening to indigenous voices, respecting their knowledge, and supporting their self-determination. Solutions can't be imposed from the outside, they need to come from within.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, for our final stop on this deep dive, let's go to South Africa. The report explores the Khoisan people's ongoing struggle for recognition and rights.
The Khoisan, they're widely considered to be the original inhabitants of southern Africa. But they've faced centuries of marginalization and discrimination. Their lands were taken, their cultures disrupted, and they were systematically excluded from power.
And even after apartheid ended in 1994, they were still struggling to access basic services, secure their land rights, and preserve their cultural heritage.
It's a reminder that the legacies of colonialism and racial injustice don't disappear overnight. It takes a sustained effort to address these systemic inequities.
It's a lot to unpack. But despite these ongoing challenges, the report also highlights the incredible resilience and determination of the Khoisan people. They were actively working to reclaim their history, revitalize their languages, and assert their right to self-determination. It's truly inspiring.
Their story, like so many of the stories we've discussed in this deep dive, shows the power of indigenous activism and advocacy.
And that brings us to the end of our journey through the Indigenous World 2008. We've traveled across continents, explored a wide range of issues, and hopefully gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of Indigenous rights in a global context.
I think it's safe to say we've only just scratched the surface, but hopefully this deep dive has sparked your curiosity to learn more.
Absolutely. There are so many resources out there, so many organizations doing incredible work. So I encourage you to keep learning, stay informed, and find ways to support Indigenous communities in your own way.
Every voice, every action can make a difference. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.
See you then.